Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing the vestibular system. So to start with, let me summarise where we've got to so far. So we have now studied the 5 sensory parts of the vestibular system. We've studied the 2 maculae, which are in the 2 otolith organs, the utricle and the saccule. And of course you'll have these on both sides of the head in both vestibular systems, and we've seen that these will change the information that they are sending to the brain, i.e. the pattern of activation and inactivation of the bipolar neurons that are going to the brain from the hair cells of these maculae. Those patterns will change in response to a change in the orientation of your head with respect to the gravitational field, and also with linear motion. So linear motion forwards, linear motion sideways, linear motion up and down. All of these things will change the pattern of activation and inactivation that is being sent to the brain, and the brain in principle can interpret that information. So, those are the 2 maculae of the otolith organs. We've also seen that on each side you have 3 cristae, which are in the ampullae of the semicircular ducts, and we've seen that these are involved in sending information that can be interpreted by the brain to give us an idea of our current rotational motion of the head. And we've seen that the cristae are going to work in pairs, so the 2 cristae in the 2 horizontal semicircular ducts will work as a pair, and when one's active the other will be inactivated. The cristae in the anterior semicircular duct on one side will then be partnered with a crista in the contralateral posterior semicircular duct, and when one is activated the other will be inactivated, and by the pattern of which of the pairs of semicircular ducts are activated more, or activated and inactivated, because of course it comes as a pair. When one of the semicircular duct pairs is involved, one of them will be activated and one will be inactivated. By looking at the ratio of involvement of the different pairs of semicircular ducts, you can then in principle work out what sort of an angle the head is currently rotating at. Okay, so that's where we have got to at the moment. We've understood that this sensory information can be encoded in these patterns of activation and inactivation of neurons that are going to send central processes into the central nervous system. So, where are we going to go now? Now we get to the fun bit. This is actually the hardest bit that we've had to deal with there. This is the new bit. This is the concept of these hair cells and the vestibular apparatus. Now it's just neuroanatomy. Now it's where is this information going to be delivered? And the first thing that I want to look at is the pathway by which this information can be sent up to the cerebral cortex. And this is important because it's up in the cerebral cortex that consciousness most likely lies. Okay, so sending it up to the cerebral cortex is where the information will be processed and brought to conscious awareness. So I'm going to show you the pathway whereby the vestibular system can send information up to the cerebral cortex. And this can be called the vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway. So I might actually just put that as a little title here. So the vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway. Oh, whoops, what am I doing? Thalamo and then cortical. I apologise for the spelling lapse there. So the vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway. So we're going to go up to the cortex via the thalamus. And just bear with me because you'll notice from the previous video we have moved desks, so I'm just getting my highlighters arranged nicely. Okay, so here we are. So, vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway. Right, so the first part of this is that these central processes of the bipolar neurons need to project into the brain, and they're going to project to what is called the vestibular nuclear complex, which is in the brainstem. Okay, so I'm going to draw a little picture then of the brainstem, and I'm going to show you where the vestibular nuclear complex is going to be present. So, there are three components of the brainstem: the medulla at the bottom, which is just after the spinal cord, then the pons on top of that, and then the midbrain on top of that. So let me just draw this out. So we'll start at the bottom, and I'll just make sure this is in nice view. There we go. So we'll have the medulla then here at the bottom, then we'll have the spinal cord below. So this is the boundary of the medulla with the spinal cord, and I'll just put a few labels on here. So this is the medulla oblongata. Then on top of the medulla you'll have the pons, like so. So the next portion of the brainstem up from the medulla is the pons. So this is the boundary between the medulla and the pons. And then on top of the pons you're going to have the midbrain. And the midbrain's got the most difficult structure to draw from the front because it's got its two cerebral peduncles coming out of the front. So here's the top of the pons. Here is the right cerebral peduncle. Here is the left cerebral peduncle. And then there's a gap down the middle between the two there. And then here is the rest of the midbrain going back with the two superior colliculi at the back there. Okay, so here is my picture of the brainstem, and this of course is the final portion of the brainstem, the midbrain at the top there. So midbrain, pons, medulla. Right, so we need to see where the vestibulo-cochlear nerves are going to come into the brainstem. So remember, the vestibulo-cochlear nerves are coming from the labyrinth. If I just get my picture back up here. So here is the labyrinth. Here's the vestibular nerve, here's the cochlear nerve. They fuse together to make the vestibulo-cochlear nerve. That is going to pass now into the inside of the skull. And the way it's going to get in there is via the internal acoustic meatus. So remember, all of this apparatus is inside the petrous portion of the temporal bone. If you imagine looking at the inside of the skull, and in fact, rather than just having to imagine, let me draw a picture of this. So, let's say we have taken the top of someone's skull off, and we're now looking inside the cranial cavity here. Okay, so we're looking from the above. We've taken the top off so that we can actually see what's inside. We've removed the brain and we're just looking at the bones. Okay, this is anterior, this is posterior, this is right, this is left. So this is the basic sort of picture that you'll see here. Right in the centre you will see the sella tertiaca, or the pituitary fossa, where the pituitary gland will sit. At the front you'll have the anterior cerebral fossa, or the anterior cranial fossa here. Then you'll have the petrous portions of the temporal bone making a division here, dividing it into middle cranial fossa, which is this bit, the sella tertiaca in the middle, where the pituitary gland will sit, and then this bit on this side, so one great big middle cranial fossa, and then you've got the posterior cranial fossa here, and there's foramen magnum. Now this of course is the petrous portion of the temporal bone where all of this ear anatomy is sitting. So the external acoustic canal will be in there, the middle ear cavity will be in there, the labyrinth will be in there, and on the posterior aspect of the petrous portion of the temporal bone there is a little hole here, and there's an equivalent one on this side, and this is known as the internal acoustic meatus, or the internal auditory meatus. And remember, the external auditory meatus is the external opening of the external acoustic canal, which is the one that you can actually stick your finger into. Okay, so this is the internal acoustic or auditory meatus, and this is where the vestibulo-cochlear nerve is going to emerge. So it's a hole in the back of the petrous portion of the temporal bone, and the vestibulo-cochlear nerves, the cranial nerve 8s, are going to emerge out of those. Now, they're going to emerge right up against the anterior surface of the brainstem. You see all of this, it's sitting against that piece of bone there. So if the spinal cord comes up here, and then the brainstem is going to be sitting here. So it's actually going to be coming out at the front of the brainstem here, and in fact the vestibulo-cochlear nerves are going to enter the brain at the level of the brainstem. So let me show you where they're actually going to enter. They're going to enter at the junction between the medulla and the pons, like so. So these are meant to be representing the vestibulo-cochlear nerve, so I'll just label them up as such. So these are the cranial nerve 8s. Okay, right, so the central processes then of the bipolar neurons that are innervating the sensory apparatuses of the vestibular system are going to be coming in these nerves here, and therefore they're going to be going into the brainstem, and this is actually where the vestibular nuclear complexes are going to be placed. So, at the back of the brainstem then, in between the junction of the pons and the medulla, and in fact part of it's in the pons, part of it's in the medulla, are the vestibular nuclear complexes. So let me try and show this. So this is supposed to give you a little bit more of a three-dimensional feeling. Okay, so this is the back of the medulla and the back of the pons, and the vestibular nuclear complexes are going to be right at the back of the medulla and the pons, like so. Okay, and you can see that part of it will be in the medulla and part of it will be up in the pons. So right at the back of the medulla and the pons, you'll have these two complexes on either side, the right vestibular complex, vestibular nuclear complex, and the left vestibular nuclear complex. Okay, so I'll write this key expression out. So these are the vestibular nuclear complexes. Right, and the reason they're called the vestibular nuclear complexes is that they're actually going to consist of multiple different nuclei. Each one of them is divided up into 4 separate vestibular nuclei. So let me now go over how they are divided up. So on this picture, well, this is a very basic picture, we'll just represent the vestibular nuclear complex as these green blobs here. Now let me draw a more in detail picture where we're going to separate one of these vestibular nuclear complexes into the 4 separate nuclei. And so let's, for an example, take the right one here. So I've pulled out the right vestibular nuclear complex here, and what I want to draw on here is the division of it into 4 separate nuclei, and it's very simple. You have a superior vestibular nucleus, a medial vestibular nucleus, a lateral vestibular nucleus, and an inferior vestibular nucleus. So let me just label these all up. So they're very, very simple. This is the superior vestibular nucleus. This is the medial vestibular nucleus. Remember, I'm showing the right one here and we're looking from the front, so this is the medial aspect towards the center. A lateral vestibular nucleus, which is that one there in blue, and I'll colour code these all in. So that one outlined in blue there is the lateral vestibular nucleus. Here, this one that I'm now outlining in orange, that's the medial vestibular nucleus. This one I'm outlining in green, that's the superior vestibular nucleus. And then the final one, again, very simple, the final one's called the inferior vestibular nucleus. So I'll add that one on here. This one is in pink down here. Okay, so those are the 4 separate vestibular nuclei that make up the vestibular nuclear complex: the superior, medial, lateral, and inferior. And again, the left vestibular nuclear complex similarly will be divided up into 4 separate nuclei, just like this, the mirror image of this. Okay, so put a mirror down there and you'd be seeing the left vestibular nucleus in the mirror. Okay, so this is the vestibular nuclear complex. So this contains lots of cell bodies, of course. Remember, a nucleus in the brain means a place where there are lots of cell bodies. A ganglion is a place outside of the central nervous system where you have neuron cell bodies. A nucleus is a place inside the central nervous system where you have lots of cell bodies. Okay, so let me now discuss what's going to happen to the central processes of our bipolar neurons that are coming from our vestibular sensory apparatus. Okay, so on both sides, these vestibular cochlear nerves will of course contain a mixture of bipolar neurons from the vestibular apparatus and also from the auditory apparatus, the cochlear apparatus, the cochlear duct. I'm not interested whatsoever in those central processes coming from the bipolar neurons that innervate the cochlear duct. Throw those away for our purposes, so ignore those. If you want to know more about that, I have a video on the auditory system and you can watch that. The auditory central pathways are very, very complicated and therefore a separate video. We're just interested in the central processes of the bipolar neurons coming from the vestibular sensory organs, and these are going to go into the vestibular nuclear complexes. So in will come the central process of the bipolar neuron, and I'll just draw out a bipolar neuron again. So here is the cell body, which remember will be in one of the Scarpa's ganglia. Here is the central process, here's the peripheral process. The peripheral process will be innervating some hair cells, so I might even just draw this. So here is the hair cell, and I didn't budget for drawing the hair cell, which is why the axon terminal is down there, but imagine that the axon terminal is plugged into the bottom of this hair cell. Okay, here now is the central process. This will be coming into the vestibular-nuclear complex, and it will be branching. It doesn't just synapse onto one cell. What happens is generally they branch out and form a little bit of a tree, like so, and they'll synapse onto loads of neurons, and they'll actually synapse onto neurons in each of the different vestibular nuclei of the vestibular-nuclear complexes. So it might synapse onto a neuron up in the superior vestibular nucleus, it will synapse onto a neuron in the medial vestibular nucleus, a neuron in the inferior, neuron in the lateral. Okay, so each one of these bipolar neurons is going to synapse onto lots of different neurons in the vestibular-nuclear complex. Okay, now what I want to do is see how is the vestibular-nuclear complex, which has all this information coming into it from the vestibular systems, and on both sides of course, and I should say that make this explicit, I implied it, but I want to make this explicit. The right vestibular-nuclear complex will receive information from the right vestibular system, and the left vestibular-nuclear complex will receive information from the left vestibular system. So we've got all of this information from our two vestibular systems coming now into the vestibular-nuclear complexes. These vestibular-nuclear complexes, they are the hubs for everything that this information is going to be used for. Okay, they are going to send it up to the cortex. They're also going to send it up to take part in the vestibulo-ocular reflex, and they're going to send it down to take part in the vestibulospinal reflex. At the moment, the bit that we are interested in is them sending it up to the cortex, so we'll come on to the other two parts. So let's now see how the vestibular-nuclear complexes are going to send this information up to the cerebral cortex. So, every single one of the vestibular nuclei in the vestibular-nuclear complexes participates in this. Okay, so it's not just a case that only the superior vestibular nucleus participates in sending information up to the cerebral cortex. All of them participate in this. So neurons that have their cell bodies in all of these nuclei are going to send information up to the cerebral cortex. So drawing this on then, here is our first order neuron, the bipolar neuron from the vestibular system. Let's say it now synapses onto another neuron here that could be in any one of these vestibular nuclear complexes, and let's say that this one is going to deliver the information up to the cerebral cortex. Now I want to stress, not all of the neurons in the vestibular nuclear complex will be involved in sending it up to the cerebral cortex. Some of them will be. Others will be involved in the vestibulo-ocular reflex and the vestibulospinal reflexes. Okay, so here's one of its projections onto a neuron now that's going to deliver the information up to the cerebral cortex. Well, actually, this neuron's going to deliver it up to the thalamus to activate another neuron which will deliver it up to the cerebral cortex. Okay, so in all of the vestibular nuclei then, we're going to be getting information we're going to have neurons, that are going to relay the information up to the cerebral cortex via the thalamus. So here is one of these second order neurons. So what I now want to see then is once this one's been activated and is now relaying the information that this one had, okay, so if this one's firing very rapidly, this one will now be firing very rapidly, or if this one's firing very slowly, this one will now be firing very slowly. I want to see how is it going to get its axon up to the thalamus to synapse on a third order neuron which can take the information up to the cerebral cortex. So it's going to throw its axon into the medial lemniscus, which is going up to the thalamus, and then it will travel up in the medial lemniscus up to the thalamus. So let me just remind you of the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, because that's what this neuron is going to hitch a ride effectively with. So there is a pathway known as the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, which is a very important pathway in neurology. It's one of the major pathways by which sensory information from all over the body is taken up to the cerebral cortex, and it's the major way in which you feel things that you're touching or things that are touching you, and etc., things like that. The way you feel vibration and proprioception and things like that. Okay, so it's a major sensory pathway. So it starts off with the dorsal columns then, which are white matter tracks that are ascending up the spinal cord. So there are loads of axons that are ascending up the spinal cord. So adding them onto this picture, let me just make sure this is in correct view. Adding the dorsal columns onto this picture then, they would be right at the back of the spinal cord, and you'd have one on each side. So here's the right dorsal column, and here's the left dorsal column. So these are massive, great collections of axons that are all running up the spinal cord into the brain, and they go up the medulla, and then around midway up the medulla, they're then going to synapse onto their next neuron along. So these are the axons from the primary sensory neurons, in fact. So to do this completely, you'll have some sensory organ in the periphery here. It might be a Pacinian corpuscle or something, but here is the ending of the sensory nerve. And then what will happen is it will have its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and it will be a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So we've seen bipolar neurons a lot in this video. Another type of neuron is what's known as a pseudo-unipolar neuron. Now, what this means is, as you can see, the way I've drawn this, here's the cell body, here's a single process coming off. Now, when a neuron only has a single process coming off, it's called a unipolar neuron. However, these are known as pseudo-unipolar neurons because this single process very quickly splits into two major branches, a peripheral process and a central process, and therefore it's as though it's a bipolar neuron, even though it's not strictly a bipolar neuron. Hence it's called a pseudo-unipolar neuron, because it's not really a unipolar neuron, because it does functionally have two processes. It's just that because our definition for bipolar requires them to be coming off the cell body, that it can't be called a bipolar neuron. So it's something in between, and it's therefore called a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So here's the peripheral process, which will be out in the periphery, maybe in the skin, innervating some sort of sensory apparatus. When that sensory apparatus is activated, the neuron will start firing action potentials more rapidly. Here, the peripheral process goes back, retracts into the spinal cord. Here is the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and then it will send the central process into the spinal cord, and this will send up in one of the dorsal columns, in the ipsilateral dorsal column. So if this was on the left side of the body, it will go in the left dorsal column. If it was on the right side of the body, it would go in the right dorsal column. So it will go up here, and then, as I say, in the medulla, midway up the medulla, you then have two nuclei on either side, which are known as the dorsal column nuclei. Okay, like so. And I should have done those in separate colours. I'll outline them to make them more distinct. So there's one, there's another one, there's the ones on the right hand side as well. Okay, so these nuclei are overall called the dorsal column nuclei, and of course you might remember their names if you've ever studied this pathway. They are the nucleus cuneatus, or the cuneate nucleus, and the gracilis nucleus, or the nucleus gracilis. So the dorsal column nuclei, if you don't want to remember those names. So I'll just add here that one is the cuneate nucleus, and the other is the gracile or nucleus gracilis nucleus. So the gracile nucleus. Okay, and the cuneate nucleus, I believe, is the one on the lateral aspect. So I think these are the two cuneate nuclei, and these are the two gracile nuclei in the center. Okay, so what will happen is all of these first-order neurons delivering their information up into these dorsal column nuclei will then synapse on a second-order neuron. So this first-order neuron will synapse in one of the dorsal column nuclei onto a second-order neuron, and then the second-order neuron is now going to go into the medial lemniscus, and this is the reason this pathway is called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. We've had the dorsal column, now we're going to see the medial lemniscus. So we've got our second-order neuron here. So here's its cell body, and now where's it going to send its axon? Well, its axon is going to go up to the thalamus. But first what's going to happen is it's going to cross to the contralateral side. So at the level of the dorsal column nuclei, you have this crossing over of fibres onto the opposite sides. Okay, and I should have just drawn it for one side. It was clearer when I had it just for one side. These are known as the arcuate fibers. Okay, so these are the second order neurons sending their axons, and they're crossing over to the contralateral sides, and they then ascend up in the medial lemniscus, which I will draw here in blue, on the contralateral side. So these structures are the medial lemnisci if we're doing plural. Okay, so in blue there, those are the medial lemnisci. And of course you have a right one and a left one. So this is the right medial lemniscus, this is the left medial lemniscus. So neurons, primary neurons which ascended in the left dorsal column, they will synapse on second order neurons which will have their cell bodies in the left dorsal column nuclei, and that second order neuron will send its process across in the arcuate fiber portion, okay, and then it will go up on the contralateral medial lemniscus, so in this case the right medial lemniscus, and that axon will send up to the thalamus where it will synapse on a third order neuron. Okay, so why was I going over all of this? I mean, this is lovely neuroscience, but why is this relevant to the vestibular system? Well, it's because these second order neurons that are going to deliver information, vestibular information, from the vestibular nuclei up to the cerebral cortex, they are going to send their axons into the medial lemnisci, which, as you can see, are running beautifully in front of them. Okay, so nicely going past them. So they're going to send their axons into here, and they're effectively going to hitch a ride with this very famous pathway up to the thalamus. So that's how these are going to ascend up to the thalamus. So the next thing we need to discuss is the thalami. So you have two thalami, one on either side. They are egg-like structures that sit on top of the midbrain. I'll try and draw them in on this picture. So here is the right thalamus here, and this is supposed to be representing the left thalamus. They, as I say, they're big nuclei with loads of neurons, cell bodies within them, and they're egg-like shapes, and they sit on top of the midbrains. On top of the midbrain. There's only one midbrain. On top of the two different sides of the midbrain is what I meant to say. So you've got the left thalamus on top of the left side of the midbrain, and the right thalamus on top of the right side of the midbrain. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the nuclei of the thalamus, because the thalami are divided into multiple different nuclei, and I'm about to tell you that the third order neurons of the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, or indeed of this vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway, are going to have their bodies in the ventrolateral thalamic nucleus and the ventral posterior thalamic nucleus. And if you don't know anything about the thalamic nuclei, that doesn't mean anything to you. So I'm just going to go over the different nuclei of the thalami. Okay, and I'm wondering, do I want to try and keep it all on one page, or do I want to go over onto the other side? I think I'll go over onto the other side. Okay, so let's draw one of the thalami then. From above is the best way to see it. So I'll do this like so. And we'll say that this is, which one do I want? We'll go for the left thalamus. So this one here, and we're looking from above, so we're imagining we're a little man standing above, we're looking down at the left thalamus, and we want to see the different nuclei of the left thalamus. So the first thing to say is that the thalami are divided up by what's known as the thalamic lamina, okay, or the interthalamic lamina, or intra rather, I think it's called, intrathalamic lamina, and this looks like so. Okay, so this is a structure dividing the thalamus up into these three different parts. So this is representing the thalamic lamina. Okay, and as you can see, this is dividing the thalamus up into three different parts. So I'll just colour this in. So I have the thalamic lamina coloured in blue here. Okay, right, so this is going to divide the thalamus into nuclei quite nicely. So these two sections are now separate thalamic nuclei. This big section is going to be separated into loads of other nuclei, so that bit's going to be more complicated, but these bits are now very simple. So this is the anterior face of the thalamus, and I should have said that actually to orient you. We're looking from above. This is the left thalamus, this is anterior, this is medial, this is lateral, this is posterior, this of course is superior. Okay, so this is what's known as the anterior thalamic nucleus, this portion here. So all of this tissue of the thalamus here, that's called the anterior thalamic nucleus. And I should say that if we were drawing the right thalamus, we'd want the mirror image of this. So the thalamic lamina of the right thalamus would be the mirror image of this. Okay, so then this big area of thalamic tissue, which I'm colouring in red there, that's what's called the medial thalamic nucleus, which again makes complete sense. So this is all rather easy at the moment. I'm afraid it gets rather more difficult. This bit is complicated. The names are just annoying. Okay, so I'll try and make this as simple as possible. So the back portion of the thalamus, this portion, and that's not a real division, that's not a line that you can actually see. The thalamic lamina is a nice anatomic structure that you can actually see, whereas this is just dividing the nuclei up. So this back bit, which I've foolishly coloured in yellow there, I hope it just about shows up, this is what's called the pulvinar. Okay, so that's the pulvinar nucleus of the thalamus. That's not relevant for our conversation. The nuclei that are going to be relevant for us are in this bit here now. Now this bit's divided up into loads of different portions. So the first one that I want to put on is this nucleus here. Okay, so again this will go all the way through the thalamus, and this is what's called the lateral dorsal thalamic nucleus. So lateral makes sense because we are now on the lateral side of the thalamic lamina. What do we mean by dorsal? You see, this requires you to understand what dorsal means in the context of the brain, because dorsal usually means the same thing as posterior, but then you'd say, well, this doesn't look very posterior. If anything, I'd call this dorsal anterior, okay, because it's closer to the anterior portion of the thalamus. But in the context of the brain, ventral and dorsal mean different things to what they mean in the rest of the body. As I say, in the rest of the body, ventral means anterior, dorsal is another word for posterior, but not so in the brain. So let me just draw a little diagram of the brain. So here's a picture of the brain viewed from the left hand side. Here's the brainstem peeking out from underneath, pons, medulla, and of course add on the cerebellum at the back there. So this is anterior, of course, and this is posterior. Okay, now ventral and dorsal. Ventral means down here effectively, facing downwards in the context of the brain, and dorsal means towards the upper portion, towards the back of the brain, if you like. Okay, so that's what ventral and dorsal mean in the context of the brain, and it's really because as part of embryologic development, and at least I think this is the reason that these words are used like this rather than using superior and inferior. I think the reason it's done like this is because the people who originally started using the words dorsal and ventral in the context of the brain, I think they were embryologists. And in embryology, the brain initially develops with this sort of like on a different angle. It develops with it rotated 90 degrees. So imagine taking this and rotating it all 90 degrees. It starts off like that as a sort of great big vertical structure, all in line with the spinal cord, and then it bends over. So this bit would start off as the dorsal portion in the common meaning of the word, and this would start off as the ventral portion. I think that's the reason that we use these words, because in embryologic development the brain flaps over in this way. And therefore this was the originally dorsal portion, and this was the originally ventral portion. However, we digress. That's the explanation for what the words dorsal and ventral mean then in the context of the brain. So that now makes sense as to why this nucleus is called the lateral dorsal nucleus, because it is towards the back. And in fact, can I make a correction as to what I said previously? I told you that this actually goes all the way through. It doesn't actually go all the way through. So it's just in the dorsal portion of the thalamus. So if I was to cut through the thalamus, if I was to do a transverse cross-section, and in fact it will be worth me doing a transverse cross-section, if I do a transverse cross-section here of the thalamus, here is the thalamic lamina. So I've taken a cross-section through there, and it's not a transverse cross-section, it's coronal cross-section. So I've chopped through the thalamus here. Here is the thalamic lamina, here in blue. Here is the medial thalamic nucleus, here in red. And the lateral dorsal thalamic nucleus would look kind of like this. So you see it doesn't go down to the ventral aspect of the thalamus, it's just on the dorsal aspect of the thalamus. So there is why that name actually makes sense. It's a dorsal, it's a nucleus in the dorsal part of the thalamus and also in the lateral part of the thalamus. So that's the origin of the name lateral dorsal. So what's in this lateral ventral portion, we could call this, because this is more towards the ventral aspect of the thalamus? Well, there are three different nuclei here. Okay, so there is what's known as the ventral anterior thalamic nucleus, the ventral intermediate thalamic nucleus, and the ventrolateral thalamic nucleus. So we divide this portion up into three separate pieces, and these will fill all of this space here. So if I was to make this cross section here, I'd be looking at this portion, and it would be the ventral anterior thalamic nucleus. So that one is called the ventral anterior thalamic nucleus, and in fact I'll continue on colour coding. So in pink there, that's the ventral anterior, and its name makes sense again. It is a ventral nucleus, it's towards the bottom of the brain, and anterior, it's quite near the front. And then what we have, the second one back, is the ventral intermediate thalamic nucleus. Okay, and I'm just being lazy, I will write the ventral there. So next up is the ventral intermediate thalamic nucleus, and I'll colour the ventral intermediate thalamic nucleus in blue here. So that's the ventral intermediate thalamic nucleus. And then finally, the third one there is then the ventral lateral thalamic nucleus. Okay, because it's kind of the most lateral of all of those nuclei that we've given the name ventral to. Okay, so that's the ventral lateral thalamic nucleus. And then finally, this great big nucleus here, all of this is the ventral posterior nucleus, and you can divide it up into two separate portions, the ventral posterolateral nucleus and the ventral posteromedial thalamic nucleus. But for our purposes, we don't actually need that sort of detail, so we won't do that. We'll just have it all called the ventral posterior thalamic nucleus. So this portion here, that's the ventral posterior thalamic nucleus, and again that makes sense. We've got the ventral anterior one up there, and this is the ventral posterior one. Okay, so those are the different thalamic nuclei then, and the major divisions of the thalamus into nuclei anyway. So the two thalamic nuclei that we actually need as part of the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, and indeed as our vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway, are the ventral lateral thalamic nucleus and the ventral posterior thalamic nucleus. So this sort of region of the thalamus, basically. Okay, right, so now that we know where those nuclei are, let's go back to this picture here. So here are the medial lemnisci ascending up. So now they are going to go to the ventral lateral and the ventral posterior thalamic nuclei, which are in these sort of regions here. Okay, remember they're in the lateral portion of the thalamus. So here are those thalamic nuclei that they're actually going to go to. And in these thalamic nuclei, what's going to happen is the axons of the second order neurons of the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway are going to synapse on third order neurons, which are then going to go up and deliver the information to the cortex. Equivalently, for our vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway, the same thing is going to happen. So we've had our primary neuron here, which is the bipolar neuron from the vestibular system. It's synapsed onto a second order neuron, which has sent its axon into the medial lemniscus on the ipsilateral side. That's important, actually. It sends it into the medial lemniscus on the ipsilateral side, not the contralateral side. Okay, and it's going to now ascend up to the ventral lateral and ventral posterior thalamic nuclei, and there it will synapse onto a third order neuron, and that third order neuron will now go up to the cortex. So it'll go into the internal capsule and then up to the cerebral cortex, and it will synapse on a neuron at the cerebral cortex. So that now gives us the question, which portion of the cerebral cortex is this information actually going to go to? Where are the third order neurons going to head to for this vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway? So, let me show you the vestibular cortex then. So they're going to go to a portion of cortex that we just call the vestibulo-cortex, and unfortunately this is a quite difficult piece of cortex to actually anatomically see because it's majorly part of the insular cortex, which is hidden. Okay, so let me draw a bigger picture then of the cerebral hemispheres. So we'll view the cerebral hemispheres from the left lateral aspect. Okay, so here is the left cerebral hemisphere here. Okay, so we can see the lateral fissure or the Sylvian fissure, depending on which name you want to use, which divides the temporal lobe apart from the other portions of the cerebral hemisphere here. So this is the lateral fissure. Another landmark that I'll put on there is the central sulcus here, which divides up the frontal lobe in front and then the parietal lobe behind. So this is the central sulcus. Okay, so where then is the portion of cortex that this information from the vestibular system is initially going to go to? When it's hidden, it is actually a portion of cortex that you have to be able to expose what's underneath this lateral fissure to see. So really what I need to be able to do is I need to put my fingers into that lateral fissure and prise it apart, and there's a bit of cortex hidden back there. You see, if I was a little man and I could walk into the lateral fissure, I would find that actually it opens up a little bit. So let me show you this. So, in fact I'll draw it on here. Underneath is another portion of cerebral cortex back here, in this sort of a shape, like so, and this is known as the insular cortex. Okay? Now, how do you actually get to this cortex? Well, you have to follow the lateral fissure around. You see, it's quite helpful actually to take a coronal cross-section. So let's imagine cutting down the brain in a coronal section, and let's see the lateral fissure opening up. So what would actually happen is, it looks like this. So here, let's say, this is this portion of the parietal lobe here, and this is this portion of the temporal lobe here, and in fact I'll colour code this in. So in red there, that's the portion of the parietal lobe. In pink here, that's the portion of the temporal lobe, and here now is the lateral fissure. The cortex continues on round there, lining this hole which is the lateral fissure, and then it actually opens up like so, and you have a huge surface of cortex hidden beneath, and this is the insular cortex, and this is in this shape like so. So if I could put my fingers there and prise the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe apart, I would be able to expose this cortex, and that cortex is known as the insular cortex. Now, it's the posterior portion of the insular cortex and its surrounding cortex, by which I mean all of this area of cortex here as well, that is believed to be the vestibular cortex. So all of this sort of region here, and as I say, all of this cortex that you have to go through to get to the insular cortex, all of that is believed to be the vestibular cortex. So if you had to give a sort of one-term answer to what the vestibular cortex is, you could call it the posterior insular cortex. Okay, however, it's more than just the posterior insular cortex, because it's also all of this bit here, and in fact it's even a little bit of the bits that are actually exposed on the surface, a bit of the parietal cortex there and the temporal cortex there. Okay, so all of that sort of region is the vestibular cortex. So, this information then from the vestibular system is going to go up to the vestibular cortex on either side, and there it's going to be processed, and it's going to help us gain an understanding of the position of our head within three-dimensional space with respect to gravity, and our rotational and linear motion of our head. Okay, now, it's going to have a lot of connections with another very important portion of cortex, which is responsible for producing the mental image that we have of the world and how we fit into the world. So let me just discuss this. So a piece of cortex that I'm initially going to show you is the primary somatosensory cortex, which if you've studied any neurology at all, you should have come across this. Of course, this is the site for where the the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway is going to send its tertiary neurons to. So the third order neurons from the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway will come to this piece of cortex just behind the central sulcus here. So this is the central sulcus here, which is known as the primary somatosensory cortex, or just S1. Okay, S for somatosensory and 1 for primary. So this is the primary somatosensory cortex, and that will process some of this sensory information, but then there is a portion of cortex behind the primary somatosensory cortex here, which is part of the parietal cortex and is known as the posterior parietal cortex. So this region is called the posterior parietal cortex, and this is a really important piece of cortex. This is the portion of cortex that is responsible for us building up a three-dimensional image of the world. Okay, what do I mean by that? Think about your very existence. Remember, all of this isn't just silly diagrams, it's diagrams trying to model you, trying to model your nervous system. You, at this moment, will have an image of the world, the image that you are seeing. You are seeing the world. You have this image of the three-dimensional world. You also have an understanding of how you fit into that three-dimensional world. You can build up a picture of the three-dimensional world and how you fit into the three-dimensional world, and for instance your head orientation and your movements within that three-dimensional world. And the portion of cortex that is doing that is giving you that conscious image, is believed to be this portion called the posterior parietal cortex, and therefore this bit needs to be receiving a huge amount of sensory information. All of the information from the sensory system here, all of the information from the vestibular cortex here will go up there, and of course information from the visual portions of the cortex will come up here as well as auditory information. Loads of information all will be sent to this portion so that it can build up an internal picture of the world that we live in and how we are in that world. Okay, right. So this answers one of the initial questions that we set out to answer, which is, how am I aware that I am upside down even when my eyes are closed? Here's the answer. The maculae of the otolith organs of your vestibular systems, they know when you are upside down. The pattern of activation and inactivation of bipolar neurons will change if you're upside down relative to if you're the right way up. And they'll be sending this information up to the vestibular cortex through the pathway that we've just discussed, the vestibulo-thalamo-cortical pathway, and then from the vestibular cortex it'll be going up to the posterior parietal cortex, and you'll have that picture of the world that you are upside down in the world. So this is how you know that you are upside down, that even when the visual system is not sending any information to the posterior parietal cortex. Okay, so we will call it there for this video, and in the next video we'll have a look at the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which is rather more simple than this, but also a lot more is known about it than this. So of course this is very sort of like, from this bit where it's gone to the vestibular cortex and we're talking about the posterior parietal cortex, it's had to become a flowchart. I've had to say it just sends the information to there, and somehow this portion builds up a picture of the three-dimensional world in which we live. Okay, it becomes wishy-washy because we don't understand at all how this portion actually does that. Whereas the vestibulo-ocular reflexes, the pathways are all understood very well, so we will be able to study them and get a complete understanding of how it works. So it's simple with regards to how the neuroscience is actually working, although it will be more complicated for us to actually study it because it's better understood than this, so we won't be simplifying it down as much as we've had to simplify this down. Okay, so enough waffle, we'll go on to the vestibulo-ocular reflex in the next video.